Limits of survival are set by climate. Those long drifts of change which a generation may fail to notice. And it is the extremes of climate which set the pattern. Lonely, finite humans may observe climatic provinces, fluctuations of annual weather, and occasionally may observe such things as, this is a colder year than I've ever seen before. Such things are sensible. But humans are seldom alerted to the shifting average through a great span of years. And it is precisely in this alerting that humans learn how to survive on any planet. They must learn climate. Arrakis, the transformation after Hark Alada, from Children of Dune, Frank Herbert, 1976. So perhaps we should add to this that while striving to learn climate, humans should try and avoid destroying the living world in the process. Because what could well seem like a race to the top in the name of climate protection may otherwise become a nasty race to the bottom of environmental collapse. So let's keep this in mind today as we discuss materials, dependencies, processing, mining, value chains, justice, colonialism, and whatever else might be associated with the geopolitics of the green transition. Thank you all for coming today, taking the time to take part in these, I believe, exciting conversations. And welcome to Prague and to Vila Lanna, of course. And now let me give the floor immediately to our guest of honor today, the architect of the Paris Climate Agreement, Ms. Laurence Tubiana, for her keynote address.
Impressive quotes from Dune, which is one of my preferred books. So thank you for that incredible introduction. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really, day to day, I'm more impressed by AMO capacity to mobilize different publics, different intelligence, different type of discussion. So I'm very impressed, I must say, by the work you are doing. And again, very, very grateful that you have invited me to begin that conversation. Of course, Europe, I will talk from this big issue about critical materials, which are so essential for the ecological transition. And again, probably without, when the humanity is facing this technological revolution, hasn't really thought about what the consequences were and how much we could continue, as you said, the race to the bottom, thinking that we are going from an extractive model based on fossil fuel to a new extractive model on natural resources for the ecological transition. So probably not so ecological in a way, because that will not be adapted to these needs and this way. But I'm struck by all the discussion on the critical materials still nowadays is not very different for what we had on the access to oil, gas, coal, big powers competition, big wanting to control these resources, long-term plans like we have seen China doing, controlling these sources. So on one side, we have to go in that direction for the sake of climate, but we should revise profoundly the model of extractive, sort of base we have been using. And Europe, in a way, I don't think we have still integrated that dimension. Of course, we can be proud of our climate action, at least until now. I know it's now a big and coming here in Czech Republic, but it's the same in France, the same in many countries. You see that the Green Deal, the climate policy are now backtracking in the political agenda. But at least we have achieved a number of things. And at the same time, it's a moment where, because of the invasion of Ukraine, the very unstable global situation, Europe is thinking more and more about security, which is logical and normal. But the way we are thinking about that, we may think twice on the way should we think about security as we have been thinking in the past, which is a hard security and not human security. I always remember this joke from, I think it was George Bush Jr., before the Iraq invasion, and the joke was, why our oil is beneath their sand? Which is, well, probably he was thinking about that, no? Why these materials are not in our soil? So it's a new era of dependency, and if we were more clever, more intelligent, we could develop the idea that we are entering in a new era of codependency and not, again, asymmetrical relations. Anyway, I think we will be forced to do that, which I think the big explosion of the US hegemony, the idea that we have to be, again, it's trivial to say that in the multipolar world, we have to revise the way we relate to others. And on one side, even if we are relatively poor in these critical material resources we need, but we have some. And that, I think, will be a thinking on how we finally don't export our problems to other regions, on mining, for example. And we deal with this mining in many countries of Europe. You have lithium here in Czech Republic. We have it in Sweden, in France, in many places, Portugal, everywhere in reality. It's just because we have not been looking for it. Lithium is, we can discuss the technicalities. It's it's very difficult to do that in an environment protection way because for the inefficiency of the resources itself. So first thing, we have to look sincerely how we will deal with that new problem of mining at home and not only mining elsewhere. Nevertheless, many of these countries that has these critical materials are in the global south, and there is, of course, already a competition. I was in Kiev some months ago, and Ukraine is rich in this critical material, and even in the worst in a way situation, they were telling me we have people coming every day, knocking to the door to have access. And that's true in Chile, that's true in Central Republic of Congo, in many, many places. So we have to think about this new type of international relations that we should develop around these critical raw materials. And we can't ignore that Europe's status in the world has changed for good and bad reason. One, because of the crisis we have been through COVID, the persistence of colonial memories, and because of this opposition linked to the invasion of Ukraine. We see now a divided world positioning itself between not East and West, but against West in a sort of broad coalition, which is not that strong, but exists in terms of the mistrust about what US, Europe, and other developed countries has delivered over the last years. So, and at the moment where we are thinking about our own security, we are in a world where this mistrust exists, and we have to deal with that. I don't think Europe could be secure in a world where Europe's status of a benevolent continent would not be accepted and recognized. So we have a lot of efforts to do that. And at the same time, there is so much competition in these areas. If we want to accelerate our own decarbonization, so we need a green industrial capacity. You will see that after the next European election, that will be probably the mantra we will be listening to, which is good. But then we have to understand how our role in the world will be if we want to do this green industrialization. We hear already protests around potential and actual protectionism of Europe in the world where we have to recognize that global trade has lifted many people out of poverty. That in a way we have to recognize that we have to engage in a fair but intense competition with potential geopolitical rivals. And of course, that's a big issue about our relation to China. So the discussion today, it seems to me, is how we think our security in a way that is not just competition between access to sources, between developing the economy in Europe, after, of course, the permanence of the impact of COVID. And at the same time, continuing to wield influence in international climate diplomacy. I can tell, I can testify through so many years doing that if Europe is not there for climate ambition, we don't have it. The G20 countries around themselves will not have it because, in a way, there will be the race to the bottom. Even if all countries are afraid of impact of climate change, but really it's an example that Europe made possible, that it was possible to bring European society in that direction that makes this role in international diplomacy possible. And just if I recognize, and with the whole hopes I have on the role of Brazil in the next year for the Conference of the Parties in Brazil, I must recognize that the big advances have been done, including when one of the very important moves that has taken place in South Africa many years ago before Paris was done because of the alliance between the vulnerable countries, South Africa, and Europe. So if Europe is not there, there is no ambition on climate change. So how we can combine this role of influence, of benevolent influence, together with our security? I think that's the most important question we have to face. One, because as you see, and we talk in every capital these days in Europe, we talk about defense, we talk about increasing the military budget. That will already come against any investment on climate fight. It's true for the budgets, the fiscal space. It's true for the European funds. It's true for even the big investors like the European Investment Bank. So we are in a moment where really we may see a huge contradiction of interest between betting on the hard security and thinking security in a much larger context. And this, I think it's a challenge for all of us who are working on international relations. How we can defend this broader vision of human security against hard core security. I think the perception of Europe today is ambivalent at best. For good and bad reason, we have been considered selfish for the COVID vaccine. It's true that we have not been reasonable in managing not only the panic inside, there was panic, but at the same time the capacity to reach out to others in a more solidarity way. We have not calculated the political cost of doing that. Again, I can understand. There was all the government were lost. They were just not being able to anticipate, but that's exactly what the security is about, is a capacity to anticipate. So I think it's a hard lesson we learn, and I hope we will remember that in face of the next crisis, and of course there will be many more crises. So we have to engage with other countries much more. It's interesting to see, I was in Brazil recently, and Brazil is seeing itself as a green power, trying to bridge the differences between the global south and the global north, even if, of course, they are attracted by the narrative of China and Russia about the opposition to, of course, a traditional nemesis, which is the United States. So I think if we are able, as a European, to engage in a more humble way, not patronizing, not saying we have the recipe, but we understand your issues, we understand the political economy of each of these countries as we would like you to understand our own political economy, I think we will make enormous progress in the way Europe could be accepted and recognized. Many countries understandably see China's role as beneficial. It's sometimes a mixed feelings, but it's true that the way that China has invested heavily, it has stopped doing it through this Belt and Road Initiative. But that was an increase of investment that was really welcome, with no conditional attached, well, condition only on the payback to China, which of course is now a problem because of the indebtedness of all these countries. And I think that at the same time we are looking for this codependence to continue in a fruitful way through this critical material access, we should look seriously at the problem of indebtedness of all these countries that cannot now fund their health, their education, because of this debt service. So I would think the international financial architecture, the way we relate with these countries that are now, for some of them, of course the less developed ones, under this enormous macroeconomic pressure, we should not have access to those resources when they cannot fund their own education system or their own health system. So I think the first logic is not to try to, ask countries to choose. That's a traditional, in a way, US policy to say you are my enemy or you are my friend. And traditionally, which I never find particularly efficient, the enemies of my enemies are my friend, which is a classical, US stand. Sometimes those really bad results, you remember Afghanistan and Iraq and many others. But I think we should not ask countries to choose and to pick up. That we have to accept that we are in a multipolar world and we have to play our game in a way that attract more respect than asking countries to choose. And I can tell it was very difficult to see the reaction, even if we were struck by the war in Europe we are facing. The Europeans were, because of this, the same like in COVID, the panic of having Europe in war, at war, asking every country to position itself vis-à-vis this war, which was not in their territory. And did we ask countries to choose in Sudan, to choose in Syria? No, we didn't do that. So we are asking the entire world to choose and pick sides in a conflict that is our conflict. And again, we can track the reasons of this conflict. We are at war. I totally share the public opinion here and your government positioning that we are at war, even if the war is not in our soil directly. So don't ask countries to pick sides. And I do think that it would be very good now to develop a new type of partnership. What if we develop, and I think there are some interesting attempts from different countries, unfortunately too much on a bilateral basis within European countries. I'm thinking about Germany reaching out to Chile, France the same. I think we should have a common approach to this access to critical material in a way that allow an element of development of the industry in these countries. So that first, codependency could be a super positive orientation. More than the de-risking stance, that narrative against China that is developed by the Commission, which in my view, for the moment, doesn't have a lot of results. We will be dependent on China for many years to come. But of course, we have to be prudent. We have to understand all the problem of and the fight of influence that this big country wants to. But to try to show that the aggressive diplomacy doesn't pay off where cooperation pays off. You know, even China is sensitive to international reputation. And they know they can't invest outside as they would like to do if they have not created the trust condition. You know, that's not to pick sides, but to understand that trust is reciprocal. And I think we could do better than that, mostly through a more cohesive, which is sort of course, always difficult to reach, a common policy vis-à-vis these big powers. So this true partnership, I think, can be invented. There are stories in the past we could learn from. But, you know, I think we could have templates in many countries to do that. What do you want to develop in your own country? What Chile wants to develop on batteries development that can create and share the value added between the different countries. So invent the new type of codependencies, template and contracts that we should be looking for. I think Europe should lead on climate finance. As I mentioned, I think we missed a point through all the ideas that picking a number of big emitting countries and trying to organize a financing of this transition. That was the case for South Africa. That was the case for Indonesia. We have not been successful, probably because that there was not enough resources. And I think the idea that the move toward that was enough, where the money was not there enough, has created more political problems than positive reactions. And again, we probably were too dependent on the US policy vis-à-vis these countries. I'm thinking in particular about Indonesia. And that has created a lot of disappointment. Not distrust, but disappointment. So I would consider that the main task of Europe now is really, on one side, to accept that some environmental consequences will happen in our own territories, that we have to develop a more fair contract of codependence and co-development with other countries, and at the same time try to, in a way, rethink more deeply the way we rely on extractive model versus a much more circular one. We should, and that could be maybe even if climate change will not be at the top of the next Commission agenda for bad reason, but that probably will be the case at least, because again, security will be the top problem. I think we can make the case that the circular economy is an imperative. We could absolutely develop around these critical materials a fully circular economy. That's technically possible. It's not economical, for the moment, economical viable, because we have not created the regulation necessary. So at least that could be a way to have a more secure global world if we don't rely on this extractivism. Extractivism has been, across so many centuries, the reason for war, and the reason for fights, and the reason for control. So having a sort of a more moderate type of economy, taking care of everyone, environment, it's the notion of the security we should promote. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this keynote address. I think you really set the floor very well for well, all the discussions that we're going to be having not only throughout this day, but throughout probably the upcoming years and decades. Now, before we get ourselves into the opening plenary, I'll just ask for one click. As you may know, those who received the last email from me, there is a Padlet board that we created, well, my colleague Nina did really, that you can try to scan the QR code or open it through the email or just punch in the link. And at the Padlet, you will see a separate box for each of the sessions that we have today that you can comment, put questions to, react to, etc. We'll try to take stock during the day, so maybe even pose some questions from the Padlet. And otherwise, that will be something that we will be also reflecting in the final conference report. So please do that. I don't know if the QR code is in good enough quality, but let's see. Otherwise, you can just punch in the link. And without further ado, I would like now to welcome on stage in the opening plenary Buisson, Daria Ivleva, Olivia Lazard, and Julia Leventon. Please. Now, just a quick introduction from my side. I'm not sure that everybody in the back sees us very well, but at least I hope that you can hear us. So, on my right, Buisson works as a critical materials analyst at the International Energy Agency, contributing, among other things, to the World Energy Outlook. And prior to this, he worked on critical raw materials and conflict minerals for the French public administration. And should I say that his presence here in this room is a little bit of a miracle, because only 18 hours ago he did not have hold of his travel documents. So thank you, Eric, for making it here, and we are very much looking forward. Now, further on the right, on my right, Daria Ivleva is a senior advisor at adelphi, a leading think and do tank for climate, environment, and development. And geopolitics of decarbonization are one of her core topics. And she authored or co-authored a paper which is actually entitled Geopolitics of Decarbonization Towards an Analytical Framework. That I think has been a real eye-opener for me. And I really recommend it to anybody in this room to read to get a better horizontal understanding of the topic. So welcome, Daria. Now, towards my left, we have Olivia Lazard, who is a fellow at Carnegie Europe with extensive experience in environmental peacemaking and mediation, both in research and in practice. And this leads her, among other things, to study the risks of conflict and fragility associated to climate change and the environmental collapse. And she had to do some big tweaks in her schedule to be able to make it to Prague, again, after some years, and we really appreciate it, so welcome, Olivia. And lastly, we have Julia Leventon, who is a professor in sustainability science, but also the head of department at the Human Dimension of Global Change at Czech Academy of Sciences. So effectively, this is her home soil, because this is a Czech Academy of Sciences venue. And among other things, she has collaborated both with the IPCC and IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So, what better panel to start with than this? I think I would just like to set the stage very briefly. First of all, and it was already mentioned by Laurence in her keynote, we do understand by now that climate is a political topic, and increasingly that it is becoming a geopolitical one as well. And both in the context of climate impacts and in what we now call the green transition. And I think this brings us also back to the late Bruno Latour, who wrote, "People generally talk about geopolitics as if the prefix geo merely designated the framework in which a political action occurs. Yet, what is changing is that, henceforth, the geo designates an agent that participates in public life." So, in other words, the Earth, triggered by human-induced warming, becomes a political actor, and a geopolitical one for that matter as well. And maybe more practically, in her address some 5 years ago, Ursula von der Leyen, when she was presenting the College of Commissioners, well, on one hand, she recalled the general strike in Czechoslovakia during the Velvet Revolution, but I think more importantly for today, she set the ambition to lead a geopolitical commission. And this ambition was perhaps most visibly taken forward by the High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, Josep Borrell, who commonly links it to the question of dependencies and a proclaimed ambition to reestablish a level playing field for Europe in relation to the US and China and others. So let's start unpacking this conundrum with Daria. What does this geopolitical lens bring us? How does it help us navigate the landscape and what is actually happening in the world today?
Hello everyone, I'm going to stand, so hopefully you can see me better while we're talking. May I ask for the slide? There it is, the arrows. In all fairness, my colleagues make fun of me because I use many arrows and graphs. But it's sometimes helpful. So thanks so much for this great introduction. And it's quite interesting. So on a personal note, when I wrote this paper, it was in 2019. And that was the time when we, from the climate community as a will, or decarbonization community, had to be convincing policymakers, especially foreign policymakers, that this is a geopolitical issue. Obviously now, nobody needs to be convinced anymore. I think we're all on the same page, and so I might say some trivial things, but the idea is to set the scene a bit on how we can think about these topics. And this particularly says decarbonization, but you could also say green transition, energy transition, all these transition processes that we're sort of in the middle of. So just on this theoretical framework, very briefly, what the idea of this is that on the one hand, you have the transition processes, decarbonization specifically. That in itself is very complex. And this is this multi-level perspective by Gilles and others that say, okay, we have the political dimension of this, we have the socio-technical and the techno-economic dimension. So there will be people who see that as technical innovation and how technologies spread. Do we have the right technologies? How much do they cost? Which would be the techno-economic perspective. The socio-technical perspective. The techno-economic perspective will be all about the resources, the infrastructure that we need. We see this with green energy and green industry massively. So we are really talking about, okay, so if we need hydrogen, where is infrastructure? How do we build it today? How much will it cost? Will there be enough? Etc., etc. So these are all the different economic perspectives. And then, of course, you have the political perspective, which I don't have to explain to this audience, I suppose. So it's all about the interests, the laws, how the policies around this are being made. And while this is happening in terms of transition, this, of course, interacts with the international framework. And there, just some words on geopolitics. So this paper particularly suggests not to use it lightly, to speak about geopolitics whenever you have the international relations on the one hand, so international politics, and geographical factors in these interacts. So geographical factors being either the location of countries or the natural resources, the assets, etc. And when we speak about this interaction, we speak about geopolitics and not international relations broadly, which include many other things. And then, of course, if we speak about geographical factors, you immediately understand that this has a lot of links to these processes of decarbonization that I've just described. I mean, also quite trivial, it is about resources, it is about supply chains, it is about where the countries are and how can they relate to each other, the partnership that they make. And the idea back then was to say, okay, so it interacts both ways. On the one hand, the geopolitics impacts the transition, something everybody has seen in recent years. So all of a sudden you'd have different availabilities of resources. It may accelerate transition as well. It may slow it down, depending. It's actually a big debate. What happened since the invasion of Ukraine? Did it slow it down, or did it maybe accelerate the transition on some points? And on the other hand, it's also the other way around. So of course, decarbonization, while economies change, impact the international relations. So this is on this graph, just to set the scene. And I think the main message today, in my limited time, that I would like to leave with you is that every economy will have to grapple with geopolitics. So it's not like we are now in an economy that is more geopolitical, and when we transition to green economy, it will be less geopolitical. It will always be geopolitical, or it will always be embedded in these different interactions. So economy A, economy B, and the process in between. So I think when people sometimes frame it as in like green economy, it's nice to talk about, but we have immediate geopolitical factors to deal with. That's the framing that I do not particularly share. And I would say you will always have to deal with geopolitics, and it can accelerate your transition. And the thing is, for instance, if we talk to countries, of course we need to see how they see themselves in the world, how they position themselves in the world, what do they strive for, to even start a conversation about what partnership can be for them as well. And so this is, in the end, about it may be a most resilient pathway within this dynamics of this interaction. So it's not about more or less geopolitical, it's about how do we find a most resilient pathway with diminished risks in this dynamics. And this in itself is very, very difficult, right? Because how do we know? We have a lot of knowledge, but of course there are a lot of unknowns. And therefore, it's seeking for these resilient pathways. If we have to make a geopolitical, quote-unquote, decision as opposed to working for the climate, it is just time, where it's a borrowed time, right? So at some point, if we prioritize one risk over the other, we will have to go back to that resilient pathway, and that might mean that we have to invest more in going back to it. And sometimes these are the hard decisions that we have to make, but it's not that, we can't prioritize the so-called realpolitik over something else. It's just that we are prioritizing different risks, and we have to grapple with the consequences of these decisions. So this is, I guess, the overall message that I bring with this graph and the many arrows. And just, do I still have some time? 2 minutes. So I would like to say that from this, actually, I'm not a scientist, and this is a rare occasion where I got to do some thinking, but I usually work with policymakers, and we have been working on climate diplomacy and external action on climate for quite a while. So what does this mean for Europe? Just to name 4 tasks that, you can frame it in different ways, but 4 tasks for the external action, which doesn't only mean diplomacy, it means also trade, etc., etc. First, Europe has to promote transition worldwide to even be able to create the resilient framework. That was just mentioned. Europe is sort of a pioneer of ambition. On the other hand, Europe needs to mitigate the risks that its own transition creates. So if our fossil fuel demand goes down, what does this mean for the suppliers, right? But also, on the other hand, if our demand for green materials goes up, what risks does it create for our suppliers? And on the other hand, the external action needs to accompany Europe's own transition and de-risk it, to not, again, resilient pathways as opposed to high-risk pathways. What does this mean for foreign policy, for external action? And the 4th one is, of course, bringing together these different goals, because green transition, we all know that that's not the only goal one might have on the international stage. So what is the synergetic way of bringing these goals together, as opposed to trade-offs, creating trade-offs? So how can we reduce trade-offs? Can we find synergies? And what do we need to do in order to take the more synergetic pathway? So these are just some remarks, and I'm sure we will dig deep on how to do this, actually, with our colleagues. So thanks so much, and I'll just pass on back to Tomáš.
Thank you, Daria. Excellent conceptual input. I think by now the audience understands that we are going to have a discussion on the verge of academic and policy debate. And I think that's what's exciting, really, about this setup. And I hope that you will agree that it brings the best of the conversation. Now, you talked about risk management. How did Europe fare in managing its risks in the past, Olivia? Has it cultivated blindly some dependencies that now put our democracies and our climate ambition at risk or in danger?
Thanks. I'm going to plug in back to what Daria said in a couple of ways, and I really appreciate the conceptualization because it's very well sort of framed. Daria, you said we spent as researchers a lot of time trying to convince policymakers for a number of years that the transition was going to be geopolitical. We're paying the price today of not having seen that before. And the way in which I make sense of the story now is through a framing that I've been sort of, trying to work on over the past year in a paper which just, I keep on coming back to. I think I'm on the 15th draft or something. And I call it the Anthropolitic, which is essentially the return of realpolitik in the Anthropocene. And it sort of takes a bit of a wider view compared to your graph, but I think it's quite important to sort of set the context of what we're up against, both in terms of planetary and international risks. So let me run through it for just a second. A few data points to start with. We are about to cross the 1.5 threshold when it comes to global temperatures increase compared to pre-industrial levels. If you refer back to Dr. James Henson's latest paper called Global Warming in the Pipeline, he essentially says that we may be accelerating towards a 2-degree threshold, which we may reach within the next decade, not by 2050, by 2040. This means essentially that we're already very, very late in terms of decarbonization, and that we have not reached the critical mass or the sort of tipping point in terms of taking our energy systems and other types of transitions on the other side of climate change, or in response to climate change. You have to combine this data point with a couple of other ones. The first thing is that scientists tell us that at 1.5, we already have a problem in terms of the tipping point framework, right? Ecological sensitivity of a number of ecosystems is now starting to activate to the point where we may lose essentially certain key ecosystems or interdependencies between ecosystems, between the AMOC, the Amazon, the Arctic, et cetera, We don't know when those tipping points will eventually reach their sort of critical fracture, right? We just know that they're becoming more and more fragile, and we can already see that ecosystems are on the move, meaning climate niches are on the move. We're already seeing essentially certain places that are becoming more and more difficult to live with at certain moments of the year. And as we accelerate towards climate change and as we have instability within the ecosystems, this is going to increase in time throughout the year and therefore have an impact on geography, which obviously has an impact on geopolitics. And then the last data point is we're already past supposedly 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries, which help us to essentially sort of put into relationship climate change with the pollution crisis, with the biodiversity crisis, with the water crisis. These 3 data points give you a larger picture, which is we don't have a problem only about climate change. We have essentially a planetary predicament where we have a reduced carrying capacity at a planetary level to support complex civilizations and economic exchange. Our natural resource base from a planetary perspective is contracting, it is coming under shock. You can see it with a few data points such as what the UN told us, which is by 2030, we will have a reduced water capacity of about 40% from a planetary perspective. Water is not just necessary for daily consumption, not just for agriculture, it is necessary for extraction, it is necessary for industrial capacity, it is necessary for processing and technological goods, it is necessary, essentially, it is the primary component of any type of economic system. Without water, we've got a huge number of problems, right? So, this tells us, yes, we need a green transition. We need to decarbonize. We need to also change agricultural systems. We need to do a number of what Laurence mentioned, which is ecological transitions. But the energy component is huge. And the thing is, we have to go through extractivism. We have to go from a fossil dependency to a mineral dependency in order to create the clean tech capacity, which is an architectural capacity at a world level. Minerals are less concentrated in energy compared to fossils. We need dozens and dozens of different supply chains for different types of goods in order to deploy solar panels, wind turbines, storage capacity, etc., which on top of it we have combined with a digital transition. This is now impossible to decouple, right? Which means that our demand for critical minerals is not just necessary for clean tech per se. It is necessary for any kind of tech. And it is necessary as a geopolitical proposition in order to compete within a technological economy. Because that's the thing. We are in the midst of what we call a fourth industrial revolution, which means that we're trying to expand our economic base on the back of a reduced carrying capacity. That produces two columns of risks, which are meta risks. One is of a planetary security perspective. We have to mine more. If you listen only to benchmark minerals, numbers are contested, but they give you a range. For storage capacity, we need an additional pipeline of about 386 mines for lithium, graphite, cobalt, and things like this, right? Again, debatable, it depends on the transition pathways, but it gives you a range. This means that we need to create more mines. The mines are going to be mostly located where deposits, but also reserves, which is essentially the extractable deposits, are going to be located. These are mostly going to be in countries of the global south or in areas which have been supposedly unexplored or unconquered from a human perspective, like the deep seas, like the Arctic, like space, which if we want to go to space, we also need some materials to go and extract the materials, right? This has consequences because when we talk about specifically countries of the global south and the reserves that are extractable, a lot of them are located in areas which are ecologically important, not just for local purposes, not just for ecological services at local and national levels or regional levels, but because they're really important. The ecosystems where we need to extract or where we may extract are necessary for planetary security. They're at the heart of these sort of tipping points, these ecological dependencies that keep our planet into stasis. So we need to be very careful about how we extract, where we extract, not just how much we extract. It creates a direct link between the supply side and the responsibility of mining actors as well as investors and the demand side. Who is going to have a look in terms of what kind of standards are applied in mining? And what are we using all of these different stuff for? And how do we regulate demand? This obviously creates a direct link to the circular economy aspect that Laurence was mentioning. The OECD, the EU, the IEA tell us we have 15 years of primary extraction in the pipeline before we can hope to reach circular economic models. Particularly from a tech perspective, a clean tech perspective. So then that means let's try and sort of work as much as possible on the regulations for circular economic models. But, and this is the part that, like where the rubber really hits the road, we are having to do this decarbonization process at a particular juncture of history where we face a systems rivalry. And the notion of geopolitics is not just the sort of relevance of geography and natural resources for how we transition energy systems. It's how this energy transition, how this fourth industrial revolution is being used, instrumentalized, and in some occasions weaponized by superpowers and by rising powers. And here we have to therefore look not just at the relevance of countries in the global south that I was talking about, which are very rightly so using essentially the supply chain sort of dynamics and politics to try and sort of auction off a number of different demand countries between the EU, the US, China, et cetera, to try and rise in terms of economic power and political power. This is all fine. The other part is, well, let's look at some of the superpowers that are using essentially the competition at play at the moment to try and cement a number of different ambitions that are of a more power-related nature, which are imperialistic actually in nature. We know of China. China is a country which, you know, has this sort of role, dual role, which is actually really interesting in terms of being a global good provider by now, because they're essentially the power machine when it comes to deploying a number of clean tech around the world and establishing a diplomatic proposition, a geopolitical proposition in terms of climate security as the new framework for international politics and what global public goods are going to be about. But it also means essentially that on the back of vertical supply chains, which China has come to master, they are now controlling a lot of production capacity in countries of the global south, which they've invested into 20 years ago. But now we're also seeing the emergence of another type of security problem, especially in regions like Europe, with the export capacity that China has, for example, for EVs. EVs, which are essentially computer machines on wheels that have reconnaissance capacity, that have spying capacity in some circumstances, because the data is exported back to China and we don't know what it's going to be used for. And there is no regulatory capacity in Europe to try and prevent essentially not just the crashing of the EV industry in Europe, which will create political, economic problems, which may empower the far right, but it will also not protect itself against what data, which is a key element of geopolitics today, is going to be used for, not just for now, but in the future, and what kind of society it will shape in the future. I'm going to leave China for now. Let's focus on Russia, because this is actually of particular relevance for Europe. Yes, Russia has prime capacity in nickel, tantalum, titanium, and rare earths, not just at home. It has invested into supply chains and into foreign policy propositions with countries of the global south, where it has coupled essentially military capacity with industrial capacity. Wagner was not just a data point on the map which had random deployment. It was coming into places that were particularly mineral endowed. Disinformation, campaigns, and influence operations are being used essentially in a number of countries around the world, not just in Europe, to try and influence industrial ecosystems, to try and make sure that Russia has a say in becoming a power broker in the supply chains of the future, not just towards Europe, but towards China as well. And one particular data point of actual relevance for Europe: 1/5 of water resources in the world are in Russia. This is set to increase with climate change, not just in quantity, but in territorial distribution, which gives it a comparative advantage in agriculture, industrial capacity, and with China, the capacity to leverage this to become a technological actor in the future. These are not random stories or data points, they are connected. Europe failed to see what was playing out with the change in terms of climate security and planetary security, which was in the pipeline and which is now emerging with rage and force today, and which a number of countries managed to see before Europe or before the US, and to utilize, to project their ability to capitalize on power in the future. I'll stop there. We can come back on the implications afterwards. Oh, sorry.
Breathe in, breathe out. Okay, I think we will have to process this, but let's get practical immediately. You mentioned the prospects of increased demand for minerals and for mining. So let's have a look at them in practice. And I invite Eric Buisson. He will show a couple of graphs as well from the Global Energy Outlook, I believe. So please take us to the numbers.
So my name is Eric Buisson. I work on the IEA's Chief Energy Economists team, mostly on critical minerals. So as you may know, the IEA is an intergovernmental organization. It was created 50 years ago in 1974 in the context of the oil shock to coordinate a response and ensure energy security. Since then, the IEA has changed quite significantly, providing key publications such as the World Energy Outlook, outlining paths for the global energy system, including paths compatible with climate objectives. We collect data, track investments, provide market analysis, model supply and demand, and we also operate as a forum for our member states. In 2021, our team also released its first flagship report on critical minerals and the clean energy transition, starting a dedicated work stream. So, how do things look this year? Well, firstly, clean energy deployment climbed new heights for a number of key technologies. And that new deployment is happening at a pace that is actually faster than we expected in the past. In 2023, global annual capacity additions increased by more than 50% to nearly 510 gigawatts, additional gigawatts per year, the fastest growth rate in the past 2 decades. This was led by solar PV, with an increase of 85% new installations per year, over the year, closely followed by wind with 60%. If you look at the sale of electric cars, sales increased by 35%, which is a bit slower than the previous annual growth rate between 2021 and 2022. Before I delve into critical minerals, I'd like to insist that there's a key message of hope here. This success of clean energy technologies is making our climate objectives much more achievable. The pathways we draw more realistic. And this is a game changer not only for OECD developed countries, but also for the developing world towards objectives such as universal electricity access, as well as other energy-related socioeconomic outcomes. But what about critical minerals? And here, what we've been observing is that clean energy is driving unprecedented growth in a number of key specialty commodities. Now, that's particularly true for lithium, nickel, cobalt, and for copper, which is more of a base metal. Clean tech deployment is adding new pressures. The IEA builds 3 scenarios in its World Energy Outlook. There's a STEP scenario, which looks at what are current policies, current investments, and tries to see where we're going. There's a second scenario, which looks at government pledges and decides, well, what happens if those pledges actually happen? And then there's the last scenario, which is our NZE scenario, which looks at what actually we would need to do based on current technologies to meet our objective of 1.5 degrees Celsius outcome. And so what you have here is the projections we have in terms of raw material demand in this NZE scenario in 2030. And as you can see, lithium, copper, nickel, and cobalt demand increase very significantly. There's a key point there, is that those are, in some ways, specialty commodities. So that does not mean that it's a general increase of mining in the world, because most of the mining in the world is fossil fuels, it's construction materials, it's base metals such as iron ore, etc. And so for some of those markets, and particularly lithium, those are actually relatively small mines there. But it's still an industrial change, and there's many questions of where those resources are, whether that ramp-up can happen, and whether that can happen in sufficiently in satisfactory environmental and social conditions. Meeting climate goals means that we, wait, give me a second. Yeah, there's a few things we've noticed recently, which is, first of all, the idea that consumers and the industry are getting more and more concerned about their supplies. And for example, if you look at the EV industry, you're noticing far more offtake strategies this year and the past year than before. And that's a very significant change in the way Western industry works. If I want to come back at those three supply side challenges I mentioned, the first question is, can that supply ramp up in a sufficient manner? What we've seen is that if we're looking at a horizon of 2030, there's sufficient extractive projects announced to meet the government pledges. But the gap to get to NZE is still there. And there's two ifs here. The first, well, there's two points to point out. The first thing is that it's not exactly true for copper. Copper is a key material for electricity transmission. And if you're looking at objectives such as universal electricity access around the world, you need to develop grids in a very significant manner. And there, because copper has been extracted for thousands of years, the developing mines and increasing production is much more difficult than for newer commodities, which were less mined in the past. The second point I'd like to get to is the question of diversification of supply. And maybe we can see the second graph, which many of you have probably seen. It's a graph we released in its first version in 2021, based on 2019, and then there's an updated version here. So the red dots is where we were 3 years ago, and the main bars are exactly where we are right now. And so what you see here is where those key minerals are produced, either extracted, but then also processed on the right side of the chart. And what you can see is that there's a very high level of concentration. You have the three main producers for those minerals. On the side of extraction, there's still a diversity of supply. For example, if I go into cobalt, DRC is the main supplier, Indonesia is quite small, but that might change quite significantly as Indonesian mining industry develops. And so that might be a very significant change for Central Africa here. If you look at lithium, there's still a diversity of suppliers. Rare earths, there's China, but now we're seeing an increase of supply from Myanmar coming in. So things are a bit complicated on the extractive side. On the processing side, it's far clearer. There's a very strong dominance of one single player here. And those levels of concentrations are, of course, areas of concern for everyone, not only in terms of geopolitical interests, but also in terms of logistical risks, in terms of monopolies, in terms of costs, etc. So that's something I wanted to insist on. There's a third point, which where we've been trying to track, is environmental and social performance. And here we've seen very mixed and limited positive outcomes. On social, the data released by mining company exists. There's an increasing number of data that's being released by those companies, but this is still quite limited. If we're looking at social indicators, there's sometimes a bit of a better performance. If you look at, for example, the risks of mining for workers, etc., there's some increases there. But then, if you're looking at environmental performance, things stay quite flat in the past recent years. And that's an area of concern. There's a second thing which I'd like to point out on environmental and social issues, is that there's still a lack of connection between the downstream and the upstream. So mining companies release data, and then car producers, car manufacturers release data. But generally, they're not exactly sure where the exact raw material that's in their product comes from. So the downstream sector releases data based on the averages very often. And so there's still that connection for the downstream consumer to actually know what are the environmental impacts and of the actual product he's buying, instead of what's the general impact of lithium in general. And so that means that there's very little difference, for example, on the market between a very high performance product in terms of the environmental, of its emissions, of water requirements, and the typical product you'll find on the market. there's a third point I wanted to get to, which is the last slide, which is, I think we've gone back actually. So yeah, it's that one. So where we are going. So recycling becomes a significant source of supply after 2030. There's three great benefits to that. First of all, because it lessens extractive pressures. It also allows to lessen energy consumption. Recycling minerals is generally less energy intensive than mining them. And it can be a way to diversify supplies. Now, this is not guaranteed because they often, if you want to be competitive in recycling, then you need to have the know-how and the infrastructure that you generally have because you're competitive on the primary extraction. So there's a great question of what will be the trade models of secondary raw material here. And there's a lot of questions here, I think, that could be looked into. So for recycling, in terms of by 2040, we would expect that they could reduce primary supply requirements between 15 and 30%. And of course, that relies on good policies. Some minerals have quite a bit of values. The older legacy chemistries of batteries, the nickel, manganese, cobalt, contain very valuable minerals. And so there's a high chance that there's going to be some recycling of those minerals. But the question is, in what conditions? In what environmental conditions? And will also all of the minerals, even the less valuables, be recycled? For example, you could imagine a situation where people just want the cobalt and the nickel, and then they throw away the lithium. So that's the type of policy questions that you might have to tackle. And then there's a second type of product to recycle, which is the least valuable critical minerals. Some minerals are not very valuable right now because they can be produced quite cheaply for now. And in that case, the question is, will people want to recycle them? And that's the case, for example, for the second generation of EV batteries, the LFP ones, the ones that are a bit cheaper, which require a bit less rare minerals. But the question is, will people want to recycle them if iron and phosphate are so cheap? And so that's the second question for recycling. 1 minute? Okay, I'll just get to two last points. The first one is that we are noticing that electric vehicles are getting bigger. And on that topic, there's a lot of cheap gains in terms of less raw material requirements. We consider that if people had a strengthened preference for smaller EVs, we could reduce raw material demand by 20% by 2030. And so there's a key here point about policies and behaviors. And also there's technology uncertainty. For example, there's some discussion of whether or not sodium-ion technologies will come out in the future. And that's an alternative to the typical lithium battery. It's generally less performance for chemical reasons, but they can be made relatively performant compared to current technologies. And there's some hope that those sodium batteries can come up on the market. And here, once again, we can get demand by 20%, critical mineral demand down by 20% by 2050 if those technologies emerge. So that's the area of uncertainties we're working on: policies, behaviors, technologies. And then to conclude, I'd like to conclude on two key points. First, the value of international cooperation. I think someone mentioned vaccines a bit earlier. And vaccines needed raw materials at some point to be produced. And what happened with the trade of those raw materials, I think, is quite interesting. And I hope things won't be looking like that in the future for clean energy technologies. So there's a value of international cooperation, and it's not always a given, even between like-minded countries. So that having that forum, having those discussions before the crisis happens, is very valuable. And then the last point is the role of public information, data. In a world where people have ideas, they also sometimes need facts to confront them. And so that is always very valuable. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Eric. I think it's good to get practical, but since we really want to complete the circle, we will zoom out once again. and I'll hand over to Julia Leventon. And I think perhaps you will link more to what has been said in the initial interventions, I presume. So, as you are a researcher yourself, I think the key question here would be, what are, in research, the key levers that are identified for sustainable futures of different shapes and form that are discussed here? And perhaps then, what is your outlook in your own research into how does this impact Europe specifically?
Thank you, Tomáš. So thank you. Yes, I am going to zoom out a little bit. I'm struck often when we talk about green transition and future of our material needs and our energy needs, the extent to which we are within a path dependency, really, about our way of thinking, about where we're heading in the future. And a lot of our responses are within a status quo. So when I was thinking about, okay, what do I want to say about the geopolitics of green transition? And what I want to, I'm going to talk a little bit more than just these next statements, but what I want to leave here today by saying is that, this transition framing that we have, this green transition framing, is actually locking in certain geopolitical tensions, particularly around sort of our neo-colonial relationships between countries and the way in which we approach our material needs here in Europe. And that in doing so, it actually exacerbates unsustainability. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about sustainability, a little bit broader than just carbon as well. And I want to argue that if we want to achieve sustainability and we want to achieve a climate-secure future, then we actually need a meaningful transformation, not just a transition, that engages with the underlying causes of unsustainability. And that will require a radical rethink of our relationships with materials, material needs, and material wants. And it will require radically shifting those geopolitics in quite a conscious way. It carries with it risks, of course, but then so does the status quo. But it will radically change who has a voice and who has power in that geopolitical space. So let's start with sustainability and this green of the green transition. I think when we talk about our material wants and our material needs, we're often very focused on carbon for clear reasons. I mean, we see, I think you mentioned, we are about to surpass 1.5 degrees. We need to reduce our carbon emissions. I'm not disputing that. But we also see climate change as part of a much broader polycrisis. So it's linked to biodiversity loss, pollution, and I would say increasing patterns of inequity and poverty in the world. And I think it's important that we don't isolate carbon and carbon emissions to the expense of other components of what it means to be sustainable. See, I wrote extensive notes. So when we look at existing approaches, for example, around the decarbonisation here in Europe, we are often looking at that digital transformation. We are coupling digital transformation with our decarbonisation, our transition to net zero. And that does lead us down a very material-dependent route. We're looking for alternative technologies. But all of those in, for example, the materials that we extract, we have an impact to these other components of the polycrisis as well. Extraction involves massive loss of biodiversity. It displaces people from land. It exacerbates inequality. And so, sure, we might be ticking a nice box of decarbonisation, but we're driving unsustainability in other areas. And all we're doing is creating new waves of commodification, so new materials and new markets, the materials we need for batteries and energy use, but also then adding in extra markets like a carbon market to help offset some of these carbon emissions that we have. And so this puts green transition as very much, particularly as it's being embodied within the EU in things like the Green Deal, and in that being a green growth strategy, as being very much within the status quo. So we're making shallow changes around the edges while still driving this idea of high consumption, high growth, and locking in these material dependencies. And what that means is that we're also navigating that geopolitical space according to the status quo. We're looking at the existing powers that are there and how we navigate that space, compete with Russia, compete with China for the materials that we need for our anticipated material wants, very deliberately call them wants, around electrifying our mobility, our energy uses, for example. And I think these are quite shallow leverages, it's quite shallow levers that we're enacting here. And I think we're not necessarily even questioning the need for some of these wants. So instead of thinking about, okay, everybody needs to have their own car and a better car and a bigger car, we could also rethink this a little bit to reduce those needs in the first place. Like, why does everyone need their own car? Is that really something that we're pushing for here in Europe? And I think there's a lot of space to rethink some of those goals and wants that are embedded within that green transition paradigm that we're pushing forwards. And so I think that we need to be looking a little bit further beyond just creating a transition within that status quo to looking at what we would call a transformative change that actually addresses those underlying causes of unsustainability. And what we're finding, and what the scientific literature is increasingly leading us towards, is the ability to synthesize sort of core underlying causes of what is driving that polycrisis, so including climate change. And these are things like humans' domination over each other, so people over people, and domination over nature, a sort of a core factor or value that we are driving towards in the way that we are, or in the way in which the hegemonic powers are structuring our policies and the ways of life, the ways of society. They're about the idea of high consumption for individual material gains, and about increasing those material gains in order to increase individual wealth. And they are about increasing inequality as a way of achieving that dominance and that individual wealth. And so I think that if we were really to address those and move from, I think Laurence mentioned this idea of moving from these power asymmetries to recognizing our codependencies more. So less about, okay, here's our domination, we're going to open up these new markets, we're going to dominate the countries that you showed that have these materials that we want. We need to move to a much more respectful and reciprocal position across countries and with nature. So not just between different people in different countries, but between us and the environment in the way that we're structuring society and in the way in which we're laying out our needs and the way in which we're meeting them. And so this really means looking beyond things like the European Green Deal and green growth and questioning what are the paradigms that we're heading for here. and how do we negotiate that within the world? And it can sound quite unrealistic and fanciful. I'm very used to people accusing me of being utopian. Happens every time I stand up to speak. I get it. Because what I am talking about is shifting these deeper levers that we need to engage with are really about a managed and an intentional engagement in our own position in that geopolitical environment. Rather than just reacting to the status quo, what we know to achieve that transformation that's needed is that we need to deconstruct the existing power relations that are there. And Europe, as a hegemonic actor, needs to be conscious and purposeful in how it deconstructs some of its own powers and the way that it wields it. And that means increasing democracy, and I don't just mean increasing national elections, but radical democracy to increase the number of people who have a voice in what is happening to them, and how they have that voice, so that people know what is happening in their name, realize their role in that and the consequences to them and others. And we need, importantly, people to have a voice in what is happening to them. So it's not just up to us in Europe to have a voice on that and make decisions and impose it upon other people. But it also needs countries and communities to recognize their own power and resources. So we see wonderful seeds of hope in things like the Cochabamba People's Agreement, pushing for the powerful global actors to recognize their responsibility for past ills and to deconstruct and to change. But that will mean things like reparations and debt cancellations and the decoupling of relief and climate finance from conditionalities, in order that we are targeting those deep levers around domination, the increase of individual power and wealth, and the way in which that plays out across inequalities and drives these material wants that shapes what we say we need from the world. And it's geopolitical and it is risky, but it's no less risky or realistic than carrying on down this route that also carries risks about who the actors are and how they interact with each other, with China and Russia, and the resultant exacerbating sustainability crisis that it creates.
Thank you, Julia. I'm really happy we're not ending the conversation here after this opening plenary, but we'll have plenty of time. I don't know if, Laurence, you would like to respond very briefly with some comments rather than questions, because we don't really have time for those. But some initial remarks based on what has been said.
A lot to listen and to think about, really. Thank you. It was just very challenging for one's reflection. I think the positive message you sent about finally we could diminish our dependency is a very important one. I totally agree with your vision that we cannot shy away geopolitics. That's over. And for the climate community is really important because we tend to think things or in a technical way or in just a different, and thinking that technology revolution, as you mentioned, Olivia, we are in this fourth technological revolution, would not have political consequences. So this is a landing, a difficult landing for this climate community who have said, if we have targets, if we have, in a way, the good technical paradigm, it will work. So I think that's a very important dimension. I'm struggling every day to bring my colleagues to that thinking that we have to recognize that we are in a very political world and we have to address these issues straight away. I do think that it's a mix of feeling about, of course, just to moderate our overconsumption is certainly one way. I think, of course, for the moment, politicians are so afraid of even talking about that. So, but at the same time, looking at what's happened in the recent months, I see that, for example, Brazil could put forward a tax, a wealth tax, which was something a taboo totally, even 2 years ago. So, in a way, there is an actual public debate about inequality, overconsumption, asymmetry of power that is interesting. Nevertheless, I think it will be, I don't know how we can balance power politics, realism, as Olivia is calling for, and in a way, constructivism, if I may say so. And we probably play the two sides, how countries, even China, can see his interest maybe differently. On the other side, looking at the real power politics. So I'm not conflicted. I think we should play the two sides, because on some aspect, we have to change the vision of interest if we want to have collective action, because power relation only would not deliver that, because just that's of course a recipe for, well, we know already has been the past history. So when, of course, I work for the Paris Agreement, I had this impression that you can shift this perception of interest. So I think it would be a very ambitious target, but I think it may be the option to mitigate between total realism, which is necessary to look at, frankly, in the eyes, and, in a way, total idealism, which, anyway, will not deliver. So it's a sort of un peu jésuite comme conclusion.
Merci. Děkujeme. Thank you.